Section 48 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 15. I had supposed that the love which I felt for Albertine was not based on the hope of carnal possession. And yet, when the lesson to be drawn from my experience that evening was, apparently, that such possession was impossible, when after having had not the least doubt that first day on the beach of Albertine's being unchaste, and having then passed through various intermediate assumptions, I seemed to have quite definitely reached the conclusion that she was absolutely virtuous, when on her return from her aunt's, a week later, she greeted me coldly with, "I forgive you. In fact, I'm sorry to have upset you, but you must never do it again." Then, in contrast to what I had felt on learning from Bloch that one could always have all the women one liked, and as if, in place of a real girl, I had known a wax doll, it came to pass that gradually there detached itself from her my desire to penetrate into her life, to follow her through the places in which she had spent her childhood, to be initiated by her into the athletic life. My intellectual curiosity to know what were her thoughts on this subject or that did not survive my belief that I might take her in my arms if I chose. My dreams abandoned her, once they had ceased to be nourished by the hope of a possession of which I had supposed them to be independent. Thenceforward they found themselves once more at liberty to transmit themselves, according to the attraction that I had found in her on any particular day, above all according to the chances that I seemed to detect of my being, possibly one day, loved by her, to one or another of Albertine's friends, and to André first of all. And yet if Albertine had not existed, perhaps I should not have had the pleasure which I began to feel more and more strongly during the days that followed in the kindness that was shown me by André. Albertine told no one of the check which I had received at her hands. She was one of those pretty girls who from their earliest youth, by their beauty, but especially by an attraction, a charm which remains somewhat mysterious and has its source, perhaps, in reserves of vitality to which others less favored by nature come to quench their thirst, have always, in their home circle, among their friends, in society, proved more attractive than other more beautiful, richer girls. She was one of those people from whom, before the age of love, and ever so much more after it is reached, one asks more than they ask in return, more even than they are able to give. From her childhood, Albertine had always round her in an adoring circle 4 or 5 little girl friends, among them André, who was so far her superior and knew it. And perhaps this attraction which Albertine exerted quite involuntarily had been the origin, had laid the foundations of the little band. This attraction was still potent even at a great social distance, in circles quite brilliant in comparison, where if there was a pavane to be danced, they would send for Albertine rather than have it danced by another girl of a better family. The consequence was, that not having a penny to her name, living a hard enough life, moreover, on the hand of Monsieur Bontemps, who was said to be on the rocks, and was anyhow anxious to be rid of her, she was nevertheless invited, not only to dine, but to stay, by people who, in Saint Loup's sight, might not have had any distinction, but to Rosamond's mother or André's, women who, though very rich themselves, did not know these other and richer people, represented something quite incalculable. Thus Albertine spent a few weeks every year with the family of one of the governors of the Bank of France, who was also chairman of the board of directors of a great railway company. The wife of this financier entertained people of importance, and had never mentioned her day to André's mother, who thought her wanting in politeness, but was nevertheless prodigiously interested in everything that went on in her house. Accordingly, she encouraged André every year to invite Albertine down to their villa, because, as she said, it was a real charity to offer a holiday by the sea to a girl who has not herself the means to travel, and whose aunt did so little for her. André's mother was probably not prompted by the thought that the banker and his wife, learning that Albertine was made much of by her and her daughter, would form a high opinion of them both. Still less did she hope that Albertine, good and clever as she was, would manage to get her invited, or at least to get André invited to the financier's garden parties. But every evening at the dinner table, while she assumed an air of indifference slightly tinged with contempt, she was fascinated by Albertine's accounts of everything that had happened at the big house while she was staying there, and the names of the other guests, almost all of them people whom she knew by sight or by name. True, the thought that she knew them only in this indirect fashion, that is to say, did not know them at all, she called this kind of acquaintance knowing people all my life, gave André's mother a touch of melancholy while she plied Albertine with questions about them in a lofty and distant tone, speaking with closed lips, and might have left her doubtful and uneasy as to the importance of her own social position had she not been able to reassure herself, to return safely to the realities of life, by saying to the butler, "Please tell the chef that he has not made the peas soft enough." She then recovered her serenity, and she was quite determined that André was to marry nobody but a man, of the best family, of course, but rich enough for her too to be able to keep a chef and a couple of coachmen. This was the proof positive, the practical indication of position. But the fact that Albertine had dined at the banker's house in the country with this or that great lady, and that the said great lady had invited the girl to stay with her next winter, did not invalidate a sort of special consideration which Albertine showed towards André's mother, which went very well with the pity, and even repulsion, excited by the tale of her misfortunes, a repulsion increased by the fact that Monsieur Bontemps had proved a traitor to the cause. He was even, people said, vaguely Panamist, and had rallied to the government. Not that this deterred André's mother, in her passion for abstract truth, from withering with her scorn the people who appeared to believe that Albertine was of humble origin. "What's that you say? Why, they're one of the best families in the country. Simonet with a single N, you know." Certainly, in view of the class of society in which all this went on, in which money plays so important a part, and mere charm makes people ask you out but not marry you, a comfortable marriage did not appear to be for Albertine a practical outcome of the so distinguished patronage which she enjoyed, but which would not have been held to compensate for her poverty. But even by themselves, and with no prospect of any matrimonial consequence, Albertine's successes in society excited the envy of certain spiteful mothers, furious at seeing her received like one of the family by the banker's wife, even by André's mother, neither of whom they themselves really knew. They therefore went about telling common friends of those ladies and their own that both ladies would be very angry if they knew the facts, which were that Albertine repeated to each of them everything that the intimacy to which she was rashly admitted enabled her to spy out in the household of the other, 1,000 little secrets which it must be infinitely unpleasant to the interested party to have made public. These envious women said this so that it might be repeated and might get Albertine into trouble with her patrons. But, as often happens, their machinations met with no success. The spite that prompted them was too apparent, and their only result was to make the other women who had planned them appear rather more contemptible than before. André's mother was too firm in her opinion of Albertine to change her mind about her now. She looked upon her as a poor wretch, but the best-natured girl living, and one who would do anything in the world to give pleasure. If this sort of select popularity to which Albertine had attained did not seem likely to lead to any practical result, it had stamped André's friend with the distinctive marks of people who, being always sought after, have never any need to offer themselves marks, to be found also, and for analogous reasons, at the other end of the social scale among the leaders of fashion, which consist in their not making any display of the successes they have scored, but rather keeping them to themselves. She would never say to anyone, "So-and-so is anxious to meet me," would speak of everyone with the greatest good nature, and as if it had been she who ran after, who sought to know other people, and not they. If you spoke of a young man who a few minutes earlier had been in private conversation with her, heaping the bitterest reproaches upon her because she had refused him an assignation, so far from proclaiming this in public, or betraying any resentment, she would stand up for him. "He is such a nice boy." Indeed, it quite annoyed her when she attracted people, because that compelled her to disappoint them, whereas her natural instinct was always to give pleasure. So much did she enjoy giving pleasure that she had come to employ a particular kind of falsehood, found among utilitarians and men who have arrived. Existing besides in an embryonic state in a vast number of people, this form of insincerity consists in not being able to confine the pleasure arising out of a single act of politeness to a single person. For instance, if Albertine's aunt wished her niece to accompany her to a party which was not very lively, Albertine might have found it sufficient to extract from the incident the moral profit of having given pleasure to her aunt. But being courteously welcomed by her host and hostess, she thought it better to say to them that she had been wanting to see them for so long that she had finally seized this opportunity and begged her aunt to take her to their party. Even this was not enough. At the same party there happened to be one of Albertine's friends who was in great distress. "I did not like the idea of your being here by yourself. I thought it might do you good to have me with you. If you would rather come away from here, go somewhere else, I am ready to do anything you like. All I want is to see you look not so sad." Which, as it happened, was true also. Sometimes it happened, however, that the fictitious object destroyed the real. Thus, Albertine, having a favor to ask on behalf of one of her friends, went on purpose to see a certain lady who could help her. But on arriving at the house of this lady, a kind and sympathetic soul, the girl, unconsciously following the principle of utilizing a single action in a number of ways, felt it to be more ingratiating to appear to have come there solely on account of the pleasure she knew she would derive from seeing the lady again. The lady was deeply touched that Albertine should have taken a long journey purely out of friendship for herself. Seeing her almost overcome by emotion, Albertine began to like the lady still better. Only there was this awkward consequence. She now felt so keenly the pleasure of friendship which she pretended to have been her motive in coming, that she was afraid of making the lady suspect the genuineness of sentiments which were actually quite sincere, if she now asked her to do the favor, whatever it may have been, for her friend. The lady would think that Albertine had come for that purpose, which was true, but would conclude also that Albertine had no disinterested pleasure in seeing her, which was not. With the result that she came away without having asked the favor, like a man sometimes who has been so good to a woman, in the hope of winning her, that he refrains from declaring his passion in order to preserve for his goodness an air of nobility. In other instances it would be wrong to say that the true object was sacrificed to the subordinate and subsequently conceived idea, but the two were so far incompatible that if the person to whom Albertine endeared herself by stating the second had known the existence of the first, his pleasure would at once have been turned into the deepest annoyance. At a much later point in this story we shall have occasion to see this kind of incompatibility expressed in clearer terms. Let us say for the present, borrowing an example of a completely different order, that they occur very frequently in the most divergent situations that life has to offer. A husband has established his mistress in the town where he's quartered with his regiment. His wife, left by herself in Paris and with an inkling of the truth, grows more and more miserable, and writes her husband letters embittered by jealousy. Very well, the mistress is obliged to go up to Paris for the day. The husband cannot resist her entreaties that he will go with her, and applies for short leave, which is granted. But as he is a good-natured fellow, and hates to make his wife unhappy, he goes to her and tells her, shedding a few quite genuine tears, that driven to desperation by her letters, he has found the means of getting away from his duties to come to her, to console her in his arms. He has thus contrived by a single journey to furnish the wife and mistress alike with proofs of his affection. But if the wife were to learn the reason for which he has come to Paris, her joy would doubtless be turned into grief, unless her pleasure in seeing the faithless wretch outweighed, in spite of everything, the pain that his infidelities had caused her. Among the men who have struck me as practicing with most perseverance this system of what might be called killing any number of birds with one stone, must be included Monsieur de Norpois. He would now and then agree to act as intermediary between two of his friends who had quarrelled, which led to his being called the most obliging of men. But it was not sufficient for him to appear to be doing a service to the friend who had come to him to demand it. He would represent to the other the steps which he was taking to effect a reconciliation, as undertaken not at the request of the first friend, but in the interest of the second, an attitude of the sincerity of which he had never any difficulty in convincing a listener already influenced by the idea that he saw before him the most serviceable of men. In this fashion, playing in two scenes turnabout, in what stage parlance is called doubling, two parts, he never allowed his influence to be in the slightest degree imperiled, and the services which he rendered constituted not an expenditure of capital, but a dividend upon some part of his credit. At the same time, every service, seemingly rendered twice over, correspondingly enhanced his reputation as an obliging friend, and better still, a friend whose interventions were efficacious, one who did not draw bows at a venture, whose efforts were always justified by success, as was shown by the gratitude of both parties. This duplicity in rendering services was, allowing for disappointments such as are the lot of every human being, an important element of M. de Norpois's character. And often at the ministry he would make use of my father, who was a simple soul, while making him believe that it was he, M. de Norpois, who was being useful to my father. Attracting people more easily than she wished, and having no need to proclaim her conquests abroad, Albertine kept silence with regard to the scene with myself by her bedside, which a plain girl would have wished the whole world to know. And yet of her attitude during that scene I could not arrive at any satisfactory explanation. Taking first of all the supposition that she was absolutely chaste, a supposition with which I had originally accounted for the violence with which Albertine had refused to let herself be taken in my arms and kissed, though it was by no means essential to my conception of the goodness, the fundamentally honorable character of my friend, I could not accept it without a copious revision of its terms. It ran so entirely counter to the hypothesis which I had constructed that day when I saw Albertine for the first time. Then ever so many different acts, all acts of kindness towards myself, a kindness that was caressing, at times uneasy, alarmed, jealous of my predilection for André, came up on all sides to challenge the brutal gesture with which, to escape from me, she had pulled the bell. Why had she invited me to come and spend the evening by her bedside? Why had she spoken all the time in the language of affection? What object is there in your desire to see a friend, in your fear that he is fonder of another of your friends than of you? Why seek to give him pleasure? Why tell him so romantically that the others will never know that he has spent the evening in your room, if you refuse him so simple a pleasure, and if to you it is no pleasure at all? I could not believe, all the same, that Albertine's chastity was carried to such a pitch as that, and I had begun to ask myself whether her violence might not have been due to some reason of coquetry, a disagreeable odor, for instance, which she suspected of lingering about her person, and by which she was afraid that I might be disgusted, or else of cowardice, if, for instance, she imagined, in her ignorance of the facts of love, that my state of nervous exhaustion was due to something contagious, communicable to her in a kiss. She was genuinely distressed by her failure to afford me pleasure, and gave me a little gold pencil case, with that virtuous perversity which people show, who, moved by your supplications, and yet not consenting to grant you what those supplications demand, are anxious all the same to bestow on you some mark of their affection. The critic, an article from whose pen would so gratify the novelists, asks him instead to dinner. The Duchess, who does not take the snob with her to the theatre, but lends him her box on an evening when she will not be using it herself. So far are those who do least for us, and might easily do nothing, driven by conscience to do something. I told Albertine that in giving me this pencil case she was affording me great pleasure, and yet not so great as I should have felt, if on the night she had spent at the hotel she had permitted me to embrace her. It would have made me so happy. What possible harm could it have done you? I was simply astounded at your refusing to let me do it. What astounds me, she retorted, is that you should have thought it astounding. Funny sort of girls you must know if my behavior surprises you. I am extremely sorry if I annoyed you, but even now I cannot say that I think I was in the wrong. What I feel is that all that sort of thing is of no importance, really, and I can't understand a girl who would so easily give pleasure not consenting to do so. Let us be quite clear about it, I went on. throwing a sop of sorts to her moral scruples, as I recalled how she and her friends had scarified the girl who went about with the actress Leia. I don't mean to say for a moment that a girl can behave exactly as she likes, or that there's no such thing as immorality. Let me see now. Yes, what you were saying the other day about a girl who is staying at Baalbek and her relations with an actress. I call that degrading. So degrading that I feel must all have been made up by the girl's enemies, and that there can't be any truth in the story. It strikes me as improbable, impossible. But to let a friend kiss you, and go farther than that even, since you say that I am your friend? So you are, but I have had friends before now. I have known lots of young men who were every bit as friendly, I can assure you. There wasn't one of them would ever have dared to do a thing like that. They knew they'd get their ears boxed if they tried it on. Besides, they never dreamed of trying. We would shake hands in an open, friendly sort of way, like good pals, but there was never a word said about kissing, and yet we weren't any the less friends for that. Why, if it's my friendship you are after, you've nothing to complain of. I must be jolly fond of you to forgive you. But I'm sure that you don't care two straws about me, really. Own up now, it's André you're in love with. After all, you're quite right. She is ever so much prettier than I am, and perfectly charming. Oh, you men! Despite my recent disappointment, these words so frankly uttered, by giving me a great respect for Albertine, made a very pleasant impression on me. And perhaps this impression was to have serious and vexatious consequences for me later on, for it was round it that there began to form that feeling almost of brotherly intimacy, that moral core which was always to remain at the heart of my love for Albertine. A feeling of this sort may be the cause of the keenest pain, for in order really to suffer at the hands of a woman, one must have believed in her completely. For the moment, that embryo of moral esteem, of friendship, was left embedded in me like a stepping stone in a stream. It could have availed nothing, by itself, against my happiness if it had remained there without growing, in an inertia which it was to retain the following year, and still more during the final weeks of this first visit to Baalbek. It dwelt in me like one of those foreign bodies which it would be wiser when all is said to expel, but which we leave where they are without disturbing them. So harmless for the present does their weakness, their isolation amid a strange environment render them. End of section 48. Section 49 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 16. My dreams were now once more at liberty to concentrate on one or another of Albertine's friends, and returned first of all to André, whose kindnesses might perhaps have appealed to me less strongly had I not been certain that they would come to Albertine's ears. Undoubtedly, the preference that I had long been pretending to feel for André had furnished me, in the habit of conversation with her, of declaring my affection, with, so to speak, the material prepared and ready, for a love of her which had hitherto lacked only the complement of a genuine sentiment, and this my heart, being once more free, was now in a position to supply. But for me really to love André, she was too intellectual, too neurotic, too sickly, too much like myself. If Albertine now seemed to me to be void of substance, André was filled with something which I knew only too well. I had thought that first day that what I saw on the beach there was the mistress of some racing cyclist, passionately athletic, and now André told me that if she had taken up athletic pastimes, it was under orders from her doctor, to cure her neurasthenia, her digestive troubles, but that her happiest hours were those which she spent in translating one of George Eliot's novels. The misunderstanding, due to an initial mistake as to what André was, had not, as a matter of fact, the slightest importance. But my mistake was one of the kind which, if they allow love to be born and are not recognized as mistakes until it has ceased to be under control, became a cause of suffering. Such mistakes which might be quite different from mine with regard to André, and even its exact opposite, are frequently due, and this was especially the case here, to our paying too much attention to the aspect, the manners of what a person is not but would like to be, in forming our first impression of that person. To the outward appearance, affectation, imitation, the longing to be admired, whether by the good or by the wicked, add misleading similarities of speech and gesture. There are cynicisms and cruelties, which when put to the test, prove no more genuine than certain apparent virtues and generosities. Just as we often discover a vain miser beneath the cloak of a man famed for his bountiful charity, so her flaunting of vice leads us to suppose a Messalina a respectable girl with middle-class prejudices. I had thought to find in André a healthy primitive creature, whereas she was merely a person in search of health, as were doubtless many of those in whom she herself had thought to find it, and who were in reality no more healthy than a burly arthritic with a red face and in white flannels is not necessarily a Hercules. Now, there are circumstances in which it is not immaterial to our happiness that the person whom we have loved because of what appeared to be so healthy about her is in reality only one of those invalids who receive such health as they possess from others, as the planets borrow their light, as certain bodies are only conductors of electricity. No matter, André, like Rosamond and Giselle, indeed more than they, was, when all was said, a friend of Albertine, sharing her life, imitating her conduct so closely that the first day I had not at once distinguished them one from another. Over these girls, flowering sprays of roses whose principal charm was that they outlined themselves against the sea, the same undivided partnership prevailed as at the time when I did not know them, when the appearance of no matter which of them had caused me such violent emotion by its announcement that the little band was not far off. And even now the sight of one of them filled me with a pleasure into which there entered, to an extent which I should not have found it easy to define, the thought of seeking the others, follow her in due course, and even if they did not come that day, speaking about them, and knowing that they would be told that I had been on the beach. It was no longer simply the attraction of those first days. It was a regular love-longing which hesitated among them all. So far was each the natural substitute for the others. My bitterest grief would not have been to be thrown over by whichever of the girls I like best, but I should at once have liked best, because I should have fastened on to her the whole of the melancholy dream which had been floating vaguely among them all, her who had thrown me over. It would, moreover, in that event, be the loss of all her friends, in whose eyes I should speedily have forfeited whatever advantage I might possess, that I should, in losing her, have unconsciously regretted, having vowed to them that sort of collective love which the politician and the actor feel for the public, whose desertion of them after they have enjoyed all its favors they can never be consoled. Even those favors which I had failed to win from Albertine, I would hope suddenly to receive from one or other who had parted from me in the evening with a word or glance of ambiguous meaning, thanks to which it was to her that, for the next day or so, my desire would turn. It strayed among them all the more voluptuously in that upon those volatile faces a comparative fixation of features had now begun, and had been carried far enough for the eye to distinguish, even if it were to change yet further, each malleable and floating effigy. To the differences that existed among them there was doubtless very little that corresponded in the no less marked differences in the length and breadth of those features, any of which might, perhaps, dissimilar as the girls appeared, almost have been lifted bodily from one face and imposed at random upon any other. But our knowledge of faces is not mathematical. In the first place, it does not begin with the measurement of the parts. It takes as its starting point an expression, a combination of the whole. In André, for instance, the fineness of her gentle eyes seemed to go with the thinness of her nose, as slender as a mere curve which one could imagine as having been traced in order to produce along a single line the idea of delicacy divided higher up between the dual smile of her twin gaze. A line equally fine was engraved in her hair, pliant and deep as the line with which the wind furrows the sand. And in her it must have been hereditary, for the snow-white hair of André's mother was driven in the same way, forming here a swelling, there a depression like a snowdrift that rises or sinks according to the irregularities of the soil. Certainly, when compared with the fine delineation of André's, Rosamond's nose seemed to present broad surfaces, like a high tower raised upon massive foundations. Albeit expression suffices to make us believe in enormous differences between things that are separated by infinitely little, albeit that infinitely little may by itself create an expression that is absolutely unique, an individuality. It was not only by the infinitely little of its lines and the originality of its expression that made each of these faces appear irreducible to terms of any other. Between my friends' faces their coloring established a separation wider still, not so much by the varied beauty of the tones with which it provided them, so contrasted that I felt when I looked at Rosamond, flooded with a sulphurous rose color, with the further contrast of the greenish light in her eyes, and then at André, whose white cheeks received such an austere distinction from her black hair, the same kind of pleasure as if I had been looking alternately at a geranium growing by a sunlit sea, and a camellia in the night. But principally because the infinitely little differences of their lines were enlarged out of all proportion, the relations between one and another surface entirely changed by this new element of color, which in addition to being a dispenser of tints is great at restoring, or rather at altering dimensions. So that faces which were perhaps constructed on not dissimilar lines, according as they were lighted by the flaming torch of an auburn poll or high complexion, or by the white glimmer of a dull pallor, grew sharper or broader, because something else, like those properties used in the Russian ballet, consisting sometimes when they are seen in the light of day of a mere disc of paper, out of which the genius of a Bakst, according to the blood-red or moonlit effect in which he plunges his stage, makes a hard incrustation, like a turquoise on a palace wall, or a swooning softness, as of a Bengal rose in an Eastern garden. And so, when acquiring knowledge of faces, we take careful measurements, but as painters, not as surveyors. So it was with Albertine as with her friends. On certain days, slim, with grey cheeks, a sullen air, a violet transparency falling obliquely from her, such as we notice sometimes on the sea, she seemed to be feeling the sorrows of exile. On other days her face, more sleek, caught and glued my desires to its varnished surface, and prevented them from going any farther, unless I caught a sudden glimpse of her from the side, for her dull cheeks, like white wax on the surface, were visibly pink beneath, which made me anxious to kiss them, to reach that different tint which thus avoided my touch. At other times happiness bathed her cheeks with a clarity so mobile that the skin, grown fluid and vague, gave passage to a sort of stealthy and subcutaneous gaze, which made it appear to be of another color, but not of another substance, than her eyes. Sometimes instinctively, when one looked at her face, punctuated with tiny brown marks, among which floated what were simply two larger blue stains, it was like looking at the egg of a goldfinch, or often like an opalescent agate, cut and polished in two places only, where, from the heart of the brown stone, shone like the transparent wings of a sky-blue butterfly her eyes, those features in which the flesh becomes a mirror and gives us the illusion that it allows us, more than through the other parts of the body, to approach the soul. But most often of all she showed more color, and was then more animated. Sometimes the only pink thing in her white face was the tip of her nose, as finely pointed as that of a mischievous kitten with which one would have liked to stop and play. Sometimes her cheeks were so glossy that one's glance slipped, as over the surface of a miniature, over their pink enamel, which was made to appear still more delicate, more private, by the enclosing though half-opened case of her black hair. Or it might happen that the tint of her cheeks had deepened to the violet shade of the red cyclamen, and at times, even, when she was flushed or feverish, with a suggestion of unhealthiness which lowered my desire to something more sensual, and made her glance expressive of something more perverse and unwholesome, to the deep purple of certain roses, a red that was almost black, and each of these Albertines was different, as in every fresh appearance of the dancer whose colors, form, character, are transmuted according to the innumerably varied play of a projected limelight. It was perhaps because they were so different, the persons whom I used to contemplate in her at this period, that later on I became myself a different person, corresponding to the particular Albertine to whom my thoughts had turned. a jealous, an indifferent, a voluptuous, a melancholy, a frenzied person, created anew not merely by the accident of what memory had risen to the surface, but in proportion also to the strength of the belief that was lent to the support of one and the same memory by the varying manner in which I appreciated it. For this is the point to which we must always return, to these beliefs with which most of the time we are quite unconsciously filled, but which, for all that, are of more importance to our happiness than is the average person whom we see. For it is through them that we see him. It is they that impart his momentary greatness to the person seen. To be quite accurate, I ought to give a different name to each of the me's who were to think about Albertine in time to come. I ought still more to give a different name to each of the Albertines who appeared before me, never the same, like, called by me simply and for the sake of convenience, the sea. Those seas that succeeded one another on the beach, in front of which a nymph likewise she stood apart. But above all in the same way as, in telling a story, though to far greater purpose here, one mentions what the weather was like on such and such a day, I ought always to give its name to the belief that on any given day on which I saw Albertine was reigning in my soul, creating its atmosphere, the appearance of people like that of seas being dependent on those clouds, themselves barely visible, which change the color of everything by their concentration, their mobility, their dissemination, their flight, like that cloud which Elster had rent one evening by not introducing me to these girls, with whom he had stopped to talk, whereupon their forms, as they moved away, had suddenly increased in beauty, a cloud that had formed again a few days later when I did get to know the girls, veiling their brightness, interposing itself frequently between my eyes and them, opaque and soft like Virgil's Leucothea. No doubt, all their faces had assumed quite new meanings for me since the manner in which they were to be read had been to some extent indicated to me by their talk to which I could ascribe a value all the greater, in that by questioning them I could prompt it whenever I chose, could vary it like an experimenter who seeks by corroborative proofs to establish the truth of his theory. And it is, after all, as good a way as any of solving the problem of existence to approach near enough to the things that have appeared to us from a distance to be beautiful and mysterious, to be able to satisfy ourselves that they have neither mystery nor beauty. It is one of the systems of hygiene among which we are at liberty to choose our own, a system which is perhaps not to be recommended too strongly, but it gives us a certain tranquillity with which to spend what remains of life, and also, since it enables us to regret nothing, by assuring us that we have attained to the best, and that the best was nothing out of the common, with which to resign ourselves to death. I had now substituted in the brains of these 4 girls their supposed contempt for chastity, their memories of daily incidents, honest principles, liable it might be to relaxation, but principles which had hitherto kept unscathed the children who had acquired them in their own respectable homes. And yet, when one has been mistaken from the start, even in trifling details, when an error of assumption or recollection makes one seek for the author of a malicious slander, or for the place where one has lost something in the wrong direction, it frequently happens that one discovers one's error only to substitute for it not the truth, but a fresh error. I drew, so far as their manner of life and the proper way to behave with them went, all the possible conclusions from the word innocence which I had read, in talking familiarly with them upon their faces. But perhaps I had been reading carelessly, with the inaccuracy born of a too rapid deciphering, and it was no more written there than was the name of Jules Ferry on the programme of the performance at which I had heard Berma for the first time, an omission which had not prevented me from maintaining to Monsieur de Norpois that Jules Ferry, beyond any possibility of a doubt, was a person who wrote curtain raisers. No matter which it might be of my friends of the little band, was not inevitably the face that I had last seen only the face that I could recall, since of our memories with respect to a person, the mind eliminates everything that does not agree with our immediate purpose of our daily relations, especially if those relations are quickened with an element of love, which, ever unsatisfied, lives always in the moment that is about to come. That purpose allows the chain of spent days to slip away, holding on only to the very end of it, often of a quite different metal from the links that have vanished in the night, and in the journey which we make through life, counts as real only in the place in which we at any given moment are. But all those earliest impressions, already so remote, could not find, against the blunting process that assailed them day after day, any remedy in my memory. During the long hours which I spent in talking, eating, playing with these girls, I did not remember even that they were the same ruthless, sensual virgins whom I had seen, as in a fresco, file past me and the sea. Geographers, archaeologists may conduct us over Calypso's island, may excavate the palace of Minos. Only Calypso becomes then nothing more than a woman, Minos than a king with no semblance of divinity. Even the good and bad qualities which history teaches us to have been the attributes of those quite real personages often differ widely from those which we had ascribed to the fabulous beings who bore the same names as they. Thus had there faded and vanished all the lovely mythology of ocean which I had composed in those first days. But it is not altogether immaterial that we do succeed, at any rate now and then, in spending our time in familiar intercourse with what we have thought to be unattainable, and have longed to possess. In our later dealings with people whom at first we found disagreeable, there persists always, even among the artificial pleasure which we have come at length to enjoy in their society, the lingering taint of the defects which they have succeeded in hiding. But in relations such as I was now having with Albertine and her friends, the genuine pleasure which there was at the start leaves that fragrance which no amount of skill can impart to hothouse fruits, to grapes that have not ripened in the sun. The supernatural creatures which for a little time they had been to me still introduced, even without any intention on my part, a miraculous element into the most commonplace dealings that I might have with them, or rather prevented such dealings from ever becoming commonplace at all. My desire had sought so ardently to learn the significance of the eyes which now knew and smiled to see me, but whose glances on the first day had crossed mine like rays from another universe. It had distributed so generously, so carefully, so minutely, color and fragrance over the carnation surfaces of these girls who now, outstretched on the cliff top, were simply offering me sandwiches or guessing riddles, that often in the afternoon while I lay there among them, like those painters who seek to match the grandeurs of antiquity in modern life, give to a woman cutting her toenail the nobility of the spinario, or like Rubens, make goddesses out of women whom they know, to some people mythological scene. At those lovely forms, dark and fair, so dissimilar in type, scattered around me in the grass, I would gaze without emptying them, perhaps, of all the mediocre contents with which my everyday experience had filled them, and at the same time without expressly recalling their heavenly origin, as if, like young Hercules or young Telemachus, I had been set to play amid a band of nymphs. Then the concerts ended, the bad weather began, my friends left Balbec. Not all at once, like the swallows, but all in the same week. Albertine was the first to go, abruptly, without any of her friends understanding, then or afterwards, why she had returned suddenly to Paris, whither neither her work nor any amusement summoned her. She said neither why nor wherefore, and with that she left, muttered Francois, who, for that matter, would have liked us to leave as well. We were, she thought, inconsiderate towards the staff, now greatly reduced in number, but retained on account of the few visitors who were still staying on, and towards the manager who was just eating up money. It was true that the hotel, which would very soon be closed for the winter, had long since seen most of its patrons depart, but never had it been so attractive. This view was not shared by the manager. From end to end of the rooms in which we sat shivering, and at the doors of which no page now stood on guard, he paced the corridors, wearing a new frock coat, so well tended by the hairdresser that his insipid face appeared to be made of some composition in which, for one part of flesh, there were three of cosmetics, incessantly changing his neckties. These refinements cost less than having the place heated and keeping on the staff, just as a man who is no longer able to subscribe 10,000 francs to a charity can still parade his generosity without inconvenience to himself by tipping the boy who brings him a telegram with 5. He appeared to be inspecting the empty air, to be seeking to give, by the smartness of his personal appearance, a provisional splendor to the desolation that could now be felt in his hotel, where the season has not been good, and walked like the ghost of a monarch who returns to haunt the ruins of what was once his palace. He was particularly annoyed when the local railway company, finding the supply of passengers inadequate, discontinued its trains until the following spring. "What is lacking here," said the manager, "is the means of commotion." In spite of the deficit which his books showed, he was making plans for the future on a lavish scale. And as he was, after all, capable of retaining an exact memory of fine language when it was directly applicable to the hotel-keeping industry and had the effect of enhancing its importance, I was not adequately supported, although in the dining-room I had an efficient squad, he explained. But the pages left something to be desired. You will see next year what a phalanx I shall collect. In the meantime, the suspension of the services of the BCB obliged him to send for letters and occasionally to dispatch visitors in a light cart. I would often ask leave to sit by the driver, and in this way I managed to be out in all weathers, as in the winter that I had spent at Combray. Sometimes, however, the driving rain kept my grandmother and me, the casino being closed, in rooms almost completely deserted, as in the lowest hold of a ship when a storm is raging, and there, day by day, as in the course of a sea voyage, a new person from among those in whose company we had spent 3 months without getting to know them, the chief magistrate from Cayenne, the leader of the Cherbourg bar, an American lady and her daughters, came up to us, started conversation, discovered some way of making the time pass less slowly, revealed some social accomplishment, taught us a new game, invited us to drink tea or listen to music, to meet them at a certain hour, to plan together some of those diversions which contain the true secret of pleasure-giving, which is to aim not at giving pleasure, but simply at helping us to pass the time of our boredom. In a word, formed with us, at the end of our stay at Baalbec, ties of friendship which, in a day or two, their successive departures from the place would sever. I even made the acquaintance of the rich young man, one of his pair of aristocratic friends, and of the actress, who had reappeared for a few days, but their little society was composed now of 3 persons only, the other friend having returned to Paris. They asked me to come out to dinner with them at their restaurant. I think they were just as well pleased that I did not accept. But they had given the invitation in the most friendly way imaginable, and albeit it came actually from the rich young man, since the others were only his guests, as the friend who was staying with him, the Marquis Maurice de Vaudémont, came of a very good family indeed. Instinctively the actress, in asking me whether I would not come, said, to flatter my vanity, "Maurice will be so pleased." And when in the hall of the hotel I met them all 3 together, it was Monsieur de Vaudémont, the rich young man effacing himself, who said to me, "Won't you give us the pleasure of dining with us?" On the whole, I had derived very little benefit from Baalbec, but this only strengthened my desire to return there. It seemed to me that I had not stayed there long enough. This was not what my friends at home were thinking, who wrote to ask whether I meant to stay there for the rest of my life. And when I saw that it was the name Baalbec which they were obliged to put on the envelope, just as my window looked out, not over a landscape or a street, but on to the plains of the sea, as I heard through the night its murmur to which I had before going to sleep entrusted my ship of dreams, I had the illusion that this life of promiscuity with the waves must effectively, without my knowledge, pervade me with the notion of their charm, like those lessons which one learns by heart while one is asleep. The manager offered to reserve better rooms for me next year, but I had now become attached to mine, into which I went without ever noticing the scent of flowering grasses, while my mind, which had once found such difficulty in rising to fill its space, had come now to take its measurements so exactly that I was obliged to submit it to a reverse process when I had to sleep in Paris, in my own room, the ceiling of which was low. It was high time indeed to leave Baalbec, for the cold and damp had become too penetrating for us to stay any longer in a hotel which had neither fireplaces in the rooms nor a central furnace. Moreover, I forgot almost immediately these last weeks of our stay. What my mind's eye did almost invariably see when I thought of Baalbec were the hours which, every morning during the fine weather, as I was going out in the afternoon with Albertine and her friends, my grandmother, following the doctor's orders, insisted on my spending lying down, with the room darkened. The manager gave instructions that no noise was to be made on my landing, and came up himself to see that they were obeyed. Because the light outside was so strong, I kept drawn for as long as possible the big violet curtains which had adopted so hostile an attitude towards me the first evening. But as, in spite of the pins with which, so that the light should not enter, Francois fastened them every night, pins which she alone knew how to unfasten, as, in spite of the rugs, the red cretonne table cover, the various fabrics collected here and there which she fitted into her defensive scheme, she never succeeded in making them meet exactly. The darkness was not complete, and they allowed to spill over the carpet as it were a scarlet shower of anemone petals, among which I could not resist the temptation to plunge my bare feet for a moment. And on the wall which faced the window, and so was partially lighted, a cylinder of gold with no visible support was placed vertically, and moved slowly along like the pillar of fire which went before the Hebrews in the desert. I went back to bed, obliged to taste without moving, in imagination only, and all at once, the pleasures of games, bathing, walks which the morning prompted. Joy made my heart beat thunderingly like a machine set going at full speed but fixed to the ground, which can spend its energy only by turning upon its own axis. I knew that my friends were on the front, but I did not see them as they passed before the links of the sea's uneven chain, far at the back of which, and nestling amid its bluish peaks like an Italian citadel, one would occasionally, in a clear moment, make out the little town of Rivebelle, drawn in minutest detail by the sun. I did not see my friends, but, while there mounted to my belvedere the shout of the newsboy, the journalists, as Francois used to call them, the shouts of the bathers and of children at play, punctuating like the cries of sea-birds the sound of the gently breaking waves, I guessed their presence. I heard their laughter enveloped like the laughter of the Nereids in the smooth tide of sound that rose to my ears. "We looked up," said Albertine in the evening, "to see if you were coming down. But your shutters were still closed when the concert began. At 10 o'clock, sure enough, it broke out beneath my windows. In the intervals and the blare of the instruments, if the tide were high, would begin again, slurred and continuous, the gliding surge of a wave which seemed to enfold the notes of the violin in its crystal spirals, and to be spraying its foam over echoes of a submarine music. I grew impatient because no one had yet come with my things, so that I might rise and dress. 12 o'clock struck. Francois arrived at last. And for months on end, in this Balbec to which I had so looked forward because I imagined it only as battered by the storm and buried in fogs, the weather had been so dazzling and so unchanging that when she came to open the window I could always, without once being wrong, expect to see the same patch of sunlight folded in the corner of the outer wall, of an unalterable color which was less moving as a sign of summer than depressing as the color of a lifeless and composed enamel. And after Francois had removed her pins from the mouldings of the window frame, taken down her various cloths, and drawn back the curtains, the summer day which she disclosed seemed as dead, as immemorially, as ancient as would have been a sumptuously attired dynastic mummy, from which our old servant had done no more than precautionally unwind the linen wrappings before displaying it to my gaze, embalmed in its vesture of gold. End of section 49. End of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief.